Short-term forecasting in such an uncertain world, very difficult, so I don't know about 2 years' time, but there's certainly the scope to increase the economy's potential growth rate over the long term. You've seen that recently the Bank of England reduced its forecast for potential growth. That, to me, is the real target, getting that potential growth rate up, because that is what drives living standards and the quality of life for people in this country over not just the next 2 years, but the next 5 and 10 years.
Given what you know about economic growth and development around the world, do you think it is possible to make the order of magnitude of change that's perhaps needed in the UK over the course of this Parliament?
Well, the opportunity for the UK and everybody is that there are extraordinary technological developments going on. And through history, it's been technology that does drive long-term productivity growth, GDP growth, but also improvements in the quality of life. And so what we're talking about today is really how do you crystallise the opportunities that those technologies afford, as well as the whole range of other policy instruments available to increase that long-term potential growth rate. I think of industrial policy as referring to all the tools governments have available to affect the supply-side structure of the economy, as opposed to the macroeconomics. And so that's a really wide array of policies. And in a sense, you can have an industrial policy by accident, because there are lots of things the government does that will affect the conditions for business. The important thing about labelling it as a strategy is that signal about consistency over time and prioritisation of the economy's strengths. We've had a lot of chopping and changing in policies. That adds risk for businesses. It increases the return they need to get if they're going to invest. And so consistency is very important. I actually think to some extent leaning into sectors is very welcome, because if you look at the history of industrial policies in the UK over time, governments have identified what are genuine strengths of the UK economy. So it is life sciences, it's the creative sector, it's professional services, and so on. So it's very clear that they're strong sectors. We should enable them to continue growing and do so faster than they have before to help them export. So you don't want to do it in too much detail, because that does become vulnerable to lobbying and narrowness of focus. But actually, I think the strengths of the economy are clear. And because we're in this situation of major technological transformations, decisions taken now by the private sector and by government will affect living standards for decades to come, probably, because the technologies are changing so quickly. So it's absolutely the right moment to think about an industrial strategy that will have an independent industrial strategy council to monitor and evaluate what's happening, and to embed that so that we get away from the chopping and changing in policies that we've seen in previous decades.
Professor Coyle, anything to add?
Fusion often happens through supply chains. So leading companies will ask their suppliers to adopt new technologies once they have themselves. So that's a supply-side way that the diffusion spreads.
Right.
So there's a macroeconomic judgment in that I'm not going to go anywhere near. The scale of what investment is needed, to go back to where we started this conversation, is quite large. And it isn't just public sector investment. The UK private sector has underinvested relative to its own value added as well, and this has been going on for decades. So if you're comparing internationally, our investment performance has been poor for a long time, and that's quite a lot to catch up. So how does that translate into a 1 year or 5 year spending envelope is a different question, and there will have to be priorities set, which is part of the reason I'm advocating for the kind of focus that we were just discussing, that you have to start somewhere, and you pick some areas of the economy, some sectors, if you like, where you think you can have easy wins. But the other aspect of this is getting the value for the money that's being spent, and that requires joining up government policies across different areas. Focus today is industrial strategy, but there is also the new towns work that's going on. Economies happen in places, so that has to join up. All of the work on the health of the population has to join up as well. So it's not just how much is being spent, but how effective is it all being spent. That comes through the kind of joining up in government policies that we also have not seen for a long time. Absolutely vital. It's very easy for people in business to confuse regulation and competition policy, because competition policy sometimes stops them doing things they want to do. But they're very different tools. And there's a mountain of evidence that it's very important to keep markets competitive, because that's how businesses do scale up and grow. So we're not going to have a healthy AA sector in the economy if The thriving, very small businesses we have, median number of employees is 10 in the sector, if they can't enter and grow into digital markets. So the competition aspect on the supply side, on the structure, is absolutely vital. I think it's quite variable, and it depends on exactly what you think the gaps are or the problems are in different places around the country or different sectors or supply chains in the economy. So, for example, based as I am in Cambridge, I know a lot about the life sciences and tech sectors there, and what they need to grow is the ability to build labs and housing, the skills of mid-level technicians, some infrastructure investment and some transport investment. That will be very different from what's needed in an area like those northern English cities, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, where you can see the potential for a big increase in productivity across the area by creating a single labour market connected by better transport. And that will be different sectors. It will be advanced manufacturing and materials, but it will also be all of the supply chains and the what's often called the everyday economy. And so that is a different kind of investment. So I think it's really a question of the kind of analysis. You pick your priority areas and identify for those areas what the specific needs will be. And then that in turn determines what the ask is of government in terms of public investment. Definitely agree about devolution. If you think about how the UK differs from other countries, it's in being so highly centralised, and this means a loss of information about what matters to local economies, and the mayoral authorities are obviously going to be a good vehicle for reversing that. The other thing is obviously the Industrial Strategy Council, which will be on a statutory basis. We're one of the few countries that hasn't had a permanent body of that kind, and the reason that's important is partly monitoring the government and holding it to account, but also partly reducing the uncertainty in the policy churn, which, as I said right at the start, is one of the reasons that investment is just that bit riskier in the UK compared to other countries.